Thank you, Mu. So when preparing this program, Fred Pryor and myself, we were asked to build this panel. And we had to choose the panelists, and indeed the idea was to bring the diversity to the podium. So therefore we have not only only one woman. That's a good point. In any case, as you see, you have data scientists, professor of ethics, a clinician, and radiologists, and Fred and myself. So the idea, initially, the idea was to pick up data to build a roadmap for developing the future of AI. But indeed, we did not really prepare it like that because we, in the end, we reached a consensus in which we should keep some degree of freedom for discussion, for interaction with the industry and with the delegates. And on my side, the idea should be to discuss about the whole pipeline from not only data collection, because we have been talking about data collection all over the 2 days, but I think probably we should go a little bit back and talk about data acquisition all over the pipeline till the interaction between the patient, the AI platforms, or the patient, the AI, and the radiologist. So we can start now. Please, Fred.
Okay, so we're all monitoring the Twitter feed, so if you have questions, please put them in there, or we'll ask the audience also to raise their hands. And we want to include the panelists from the speakers from the last session in this, so they're all sitting up in front, because we really didn't get a chance to ask them questions, and I know I have some, although I did sort of monopolize Dr. Strickland during the coffee break. So I wanted to kick this off with a question that's been bothering me since yesterday, which is several of the speakers pointed out that AI has been around for a long time in medical imaging. We've had these boom and bust cycles in AI as a discipline, but in medical imaging, in the 90s, many of the algorithms that we use were developed, built into products, didn't go anywhere. So what's different now? Is this just the current shiny object, or is it really something different now that this is going to become part of our reality? And I'll just throw that out to anyone either here or in the last speaker group who wants to respond.
Okay, for me, it boils down to validation. So Ulrich Pick showed us some of the challenges that there were with CAD in breast. And I think as a healthcare community, we want to be sure that what we're using is going to benefit our patients. And I think that's the bottom line. And I think if we are able to validate AI tools that convince the healthcare radiology community that they're of benefit, and as Ulrich said, it will be through trials, whether they are post-marketing trials or pre-marketing trials, I don't know. But I think it will be through an evidence base, in my opinion, that if things will be adopted or not. So I think that's the bottom line that I see. It's going to be validation to lead to adoption. I don't know what Chuck thinks.
I would echo Andrea's comments. I think the new technology is certainly more powerful. It's given us a new set of tools that we can apply. But as with everything else, and it's important for us to take the lessons that we learned from using CAD and from the history of using it, where we've seen it, and to make sure that we really provide proof. I mean, for so many of the things that we're seeing now, I mean, we're seeing tremendous advances that are and touted as advances, and we were kind of having some of these little discussions over the break too. But all of us want to see these things proven in clinical application to really know that what we're seeing is real. And there's also some things we need to get to do. I mean, the explainability of the systems is something that we need to have built in with it.
I think that we also have to recognize that, and it has been presented here, AI covers a broad spectrum of things, everywhere from prioritizing the work list to even new ways of image reconstruction. At Stanford, we've been calling this upstream AI and downstream AI, reconstruction and interpretation. And so many of the things that we call AI, I think, will come into use very quickly. You know, things that help radiologists be more efficient, make sure that the right cases are read first, and the ones that you can wait a little longer for are out of the way. Those things will happen very quickly. So AI is, you know, definitely going to take root. I think when it comes down to image interpretation, it's going to be a little bit slower and bumpier, maybe even a lot slower and bumpier. And I for one, worry about what is going to happen to, you know, usually you go to your doctor and your doctor tells you what you need to know. But more and more, we have access to radiology reports, for instance. So what is going to happen if the, quote, AI says that there's a suspicious nodule here someplace, but that the radiologist told me, no, don't worry about it? Is that going to change? What are the patients going to be able to see? Are they only going to see the end result, the last bit of communication, or are they going to be able to see, you know, like for instance, I can look in my chart and I can see exactly quantitatively what my PSA was, right? And then a doctor tells me what I need to do about it or not do about it, and I can argue with them if I want. Is that going to happen with these AI-produced numbers? And how is that going to work?
I just to come back on the patient knowledge of what's happening, I had a very, I was surprised by the question, but it was a correct question, really interesting question by a patient who was attending ECR, and she'd come along to a coffee and chat type of session on AI, and her question was, do I have the right to ask the radiologist why they dismissed what the AI tool said? So the AI tool might have said the lung nodule is a cancer, but I looked at it, the radiologist looked at it and said, actually, I don't think it's a cancer, no problem. And she wants an explanation from the radiologist as to why they didn't accept the artificial intelligence. So that was the question about what will they be allowed to ask the radiologist? Why did you reject the decision of the AI tool? You know, which is like quite an interesting thing.
Which is kind of challenging too, because, you know, as much as we talk about the black box of AI, if you show me the CAD mark on the lesion and you say, well, why didn't you consider that a nodule? I say, well, because it doesn't look like one. Yeah, that's not terribly helpful either, right? which also brings up, so here's one. Now this is to a European audience, but you know, this is someone, I think it was Hugh Harvey that raised this one as sort of the radiologist's nightmare. What if someone says, well, we've reviewed 3 cases at your hospital where you and your mammographers have missed cancers. So now we're going to institute a class action lawsuit, and we're going to review every mammogram that you've done in the last 5 years, run them through our AI system, and find all of the cancers that you have now missed, and then sue you for them. Oh. Everyone going to sleep well tonight, right? So, yeah, no, you know, I think with all of these things, it's how we use it. You know, for us as clinical radiologists, we also, I think this is one more tool. It's like having a fellow or resident. You want, if they say, what do you think this is? You try to explain why you think it's a cancer or not. You may be right, you may be wrong, but you know, you just have to, we try to use our experience, and the hope is that if the AI systems can add to that and you know, learn from even greater number of cases perhaps than any one of us could see on a regular basis, maybe there is some, you know, that adds value to it.
So certainly no doubt that this interaction between AI platforms and the radiologist skills will be maintained for a while. I would like to come back to one of the, I think it's an important question that was raised up yesterday by Anwar, which is working in the raw data space or in the imaging space. And this has two implications in my understanding. One is on the patient side, since the data with the GDP regulations belongs to the patient. So should we keep the raw data? Because any patient may ask for his or her own raw data. Should we send the raw data to the parks and archive this, which has tremendous implications in terms of cost? The other thing is that if we are looking at the raw data, we don't know today what we are really looking at. And so this is a question for the vendors. Should we change the way the machines are built nowadays and prepare these machines for AI algorithms instead for just imaging, which is an easy task for diagnosis? I don't know if we have vendors in the room. Yes?
On? Ah, yeah, it's on. Yeah, difficult question. I cannot comment too much on it. I'm not from the development department, but we are already working with AI-empowered applications in the system, like automatic prescription of slices, auto-align functionality. That's what we have already in the product, and more is to come to ease workflow, to ease the work of the operator. For terms of post-processing, also applications are as introduced by my colleague Heinrich, in preparation, but this will work on separate workstations, so this is not directly on the scanner. Saving the raw data, that's a huge task, yeah, because the data amount is tremendous. It's not 10, 100, 1,000-fold of the data that you have now with images, and that will, as you already said, mean a lot of cost and how to save them. Also transfer of one single 3D acquisition of several gigabytes. How will you manage that? That will really change also the design and architecture of the system. Maybe somebody else wants to comment?
Yeah, there's a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really good points.
Turn on your microphone.
Is that a bit better? Yeah, great. Those are great points. But I would also add, kind of one of the biggest problems with processing raw data to the moment is that we have very little of it to learn how to work with, and it generally has vendor proprietary aspects. So it would be lovely to see something coming out, and perhaps maybe one of the the TCIA might be in one of the best positions to curate that kind of thing. Sorry to land you in that one. But for now, the answer is explainability, which a number of you have already highlighted. So if we have to create AI systems that a radiologist can at least believe their interpretation, it's got to be interpretable in a human way for the next 5 or 10 years, in my humble opinion anyway.
So since you threw that back at me, let me make a comment. It has been proposed that TCI manage measurement data, so sinograms from CT or case-based data or list mode data from PET. We know how to do that. It takes up a huge amount of space, and the problem is, what's its value? What are people going to do it? So in another program that I was involved in, the Human Connectome project, we spent months arguing about should we maintain the raw measurement data, because there would be new reconstruction algorithms that would make better use of that data than what we could do at the time. And it was only a second petabyte of data over above the petabyte that we were already collecting, and so, what's another petabyte? But in general, another petabyte is a bit more than people want to handle for data that they don't necessarily know how to interpret. So I'm going to switch, because there was a nice question asked on Twitter, which I now have just lost. Yeah, it was about if you were a department chair, exactly.
I've got it here.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
So if you're a department chair, what is the first AI project you'd pick to transform radiology for cancer imaging? So, department chairs?
So a couple of people have asked me a similar thing, how would I get started? And what I don't know, but what I would suggest is that if you have one area that you're particularly strong in your department, and there's an appropriate tool that has FDA approval or CE marking, that you say, okay, just say, for example, I'm going to take the Viz AI tool that Nicola spoke about. It's available on the market now. And perhaps you have a big stroke unit and a thrombectomy unit. And so you're doing regular CT scans for a suspected stroke, and you have an interventional service. So you say, okay, fine, there's a tool out there. We can actually implement that in clinical practice, and we can actually audit it and test it in practice. And we have, the practice that we have will allow us to see whether that tool is working in our department. So I think I would suggest that the best thing is to look at your strengths and to marry that up. Maybe you've got a big liver service, and you might want, I don't mean to do anything like promoting one company or another, but Arteris has a liver metastasis. So you might say, okay, fine, it's CE marked, it's got FDA approval, and we do a lot of liver metastases, and we do biopsies, blah, blah, blah. So that might be the right tool for you to try to implement. And there's a whole number that could fit in a particular department as a starting point. But that's just one idea I have. I don't know what others think.
I'd echo Andrea's remarks there too. It's really important to play to your strengths in a variety of ways, linking what you do with the strengths of your referring services, right? So if you have a strong liver cancer program, I'll give you an example at my institution of where we've actually applied something, and I think what part of the rationale is we're looking to bring in some corporate partners to do some things for lung nodule detection and in some other areas, but one where we've actually seen some benefit already, and that's a tool that was developed by one of our own scientists, who's a neuroradiologist and a computer scientist as well, that does lesion tracking for multiple sclerosis. To give you an idea, at our institution, we do 25 MRs a day on multiple sclerosis patients. It's a huge clinical practice, and as a result, most of these patients would get studies done without contrast and then with contrast on MR. What we've done is they've done a study that shows that if you can track these things and show that there's no change in the lesion without contrast, it means either it's stable or basically there's nothing new to look at, and you can get that with about 98, 99% certainty. So these patients are on the table, they get their MR without contrast. If we actually run this AI algorithm that's been developed in-house on the images, it shows no change. If it's then, we stop, and then the patient does not get IV contrast. So it means less time on the scanner for the patient. It means less expense in terms of administering contrast. We're hoping we can negotiate something with the payers because, in essence, we get paid less for reading a non-contrast study than for reading a contrast study. But it's a tremendous source of satisfaction for the patients, and it's a great application of AI. And so, I guess as you all think, if you're a department chair, if you're thinking like a department chair of how can I implement these systems, what's the benefit, find something where you have a big clinical program where it'll have impact and where you can do something, and also then where you can realize some savings and improve the care of patients. And that puts it in the win-win column all the way. I don't know. Any of you guys have a comment?
Well, yeah. Nick?
So I think that one beneficial area would be actually to tackle those areas where actually we don't know whether we're doing the best thing for the patient or not, and where there is AI software available that hasn't really been tested in large clinical arenas. So one area that I might pick on, which is quite specific, which would fit that bill, would be follow-up of glioma patients and looking for recurrence. Because, I mean, we all know, I'm not a specialized neuroradiologist, but nevertheless, there is this huge issue about, are we seeing edema or are we seeing recurrence? And there's a lot of work has actually been done in that space. So there is a lot of software that is available, although not necessarily on the market. In fact, it isn't on the market. So I think if I were in that position as a neuroradiology department chair, for example, I would say, well, look, we don't know what we're doing actually, clinically, with these poor patients whom we are following, and we don't know whether when we see an increase in the size of the lesion or what could be a recurrence and growth, or it could be merely the reactive edema that you see after a response to radiochemotherapy in a condition which we can't treat anyway. Here would be a really good forum for us to actually test that in the clinical setting, because we'll be making our own assessment anyhow as neuroradiologists, if you see what I mean, and we know already that is very unsuccessful and impossible, in fact. And so we've actually got if you like, a clean sheet to actually test that clinically, which may, well, if it turns out that it is doing patients good, then you could immediately adopt that into clinical practice, at least in your patients, which would be very, very beneficial to patient care, because ultimately, as doctors, we're most interested, actually, in improving patients' lives. So I think that's one arena which is actually ripe for testing on a much larger scale in clinical practice.
Well, while Dr. Strickland has a microphone, hold on to it for a second, because I wanted to ask a question about education. I'm going to ask it in a sort of a strange way. So yesterday, a lot of people talked about the black box, right? AI is just a black box. Well, Dr. Moon put up a black box, and then he opened it up and showed us it was full of Pythons. There was a whole lot of Python code in there. So that begs the question, what's the level of training that medical students, radiology residents, fellows, radiologists need to have? Should you all go out and learn how to program in Python or R or MATLAB so that you can understand the AI algorithms that you're getting, or is that too far?
Well, my personal opinion is that that is too far for most of us as medics, actually. You know, if we had wanted to do that, or we had felt that was our aptitude, then we would have become primary clinical scientists and computer engineers and so forth. Whereas that isn't necessarily where our major forte lies. So I would say that that is a step too far for most of them. I'm not saying that some medical students, you know, especially nowadays, might not want to branch out into that field, and that's perfectly possible, and they may never progress to actually become full-blown clinical doctors. They may go follow the science track, but I think for the rest of us, what we actually need is a basic, it's like learning a language so you can get by. You know, I mean, I can get by extremely well in France. I can live in France. I speak fluent French. I can get by in Spain because I know, you know, enough words. In Portugal, I'm kind of a bit, you know, challenged, shall we say. But if I were to live here or work here, then I would certainly make a big effort to learn the language in a manner that would be, you know, I could job along, I could get by in everyday life, I could go to the supermarket. And it's that kind of knowledge that I feel that we should acquire as medics, that we should be able to get an idea of reading the papers, for example, so that we can actually extract meaning from them. But I don't see myself, for example, as somebody that's ever going to be a computer programmer or somebody devising a convolutional neural network. I don't see that as my role, but I do see my role as knowing how to judge the value of a study and knowing how to implement studies to test out that software that the clever computer engineers have devised in my clinical practice. So that I'm not just, you know, using a tool that I know absolutely nothing about.
Just a quick one, because I can see there's hands up, but just to respond to that, I do think that we do need some radiologists who are convergent scientists that know how to code, that understand Python, that understand how to develop it. I'm not saying everybody does, but I think it would be hugely advantageous for us as a community to have people who are really strong in informatics and coding, that know how to do this, that can talk both languages.
It could be that computer scientists and computer engineers actually need a dropping knowledge of radiology. Yes. And that in fact, so the other way around. So that we actually include, that we have those guys in our departments. In just the same way that right in the early days of PACS, it took us quite a long time at Hammersmith Hospital at Imperial, for example, which is one of the first paxed out hospitals in the world to realize that actually we needed PACS managers. In fact, we took radiographers and trained them to understand how the PACS works, and so IT people effectively as well, who worked in our department. They were part of the radiology department. They were IT personnel who did nothing but work in the radiology department. So they became kind of part of our family, if you like, and they understood what we did and what our needs were. They weren't radiologists. So I'm arguing it might be that actually we need to broaden the imaging departments to include those computer engineers and scientists.
So these are all good points. I think there's one place we could draw a line, for instance, and when I first got to Stanford, I used to be involved in teaching a course that taught the residents how the imaging equipment worked, taught them how images were, how the data were acquired for the different modalities, and how they were reconstructed, and those sorts of things. We don't teach that anymore because the ACR decided in their wisdom that, well, probably the radiologists don't need to know that. But what's interesting here is that the part of the AI that I think we're talking about, even though it's much broader than this, is where there's an interpretation of an image going on. I think the explainability is still, at least now, needed there. Because if you get, something pops up on your phone saying that, I'm the AI and I just saw this patient and there's this thing in here you really need to know about, the radiologists need to know, do I count that with high confidence, or is that, that's just another one of these false positives? And so I think when it comes to the AIs that interpret images, I think that radiologists do need to understand how the decisions are being made.
It's not the same magnitude, but it happened with MRI. Indeed, if you know about MRI physics, it's much better for the radiologist to fine-tune the MRI sequences and to develop MRI than if you don't know it. Maybe it will happen with AI platforms also.
Yeah, I had a similar experience where actually a radiologist who also had a PhD in medical physics gave us, in our first year of, first week of radiology experience, the training in that, and it was invaluable. So I guess then the question becomes, what would be the skills that we would want a clinical radiologist? I agree with the point. I don't want to turn physicians into computer scientists. I think they need to understand enough of it. But as radiologists, we need to focus on medicine. We need to make sure that we're connected with that as well. So I'm interested. What do you think are the skills that we need? They need some statistics. They need some introduction to AI. What things should we be teaching our residents in this area, do you think?
May I?
Please.
Okay. I feel myself a little bit out of. I feel myself a little bit out of this discussion, and I apologize for being so conservative on my approach. But we are talking about very powerful technology. It could also be gene editing or something like that. So more and more the equipments are making very accurate diagnosis. Is there a role for a medical doctor in this setting? Is medical doctor still the mediator of the information? Because yes, we start to discuss about education of people on algorithms and of new models, and is there a role for medicine in that? That's a provocative question.
That's some of the aspects I developed, that integration of the clinical data and of the technical data, let's say it better like that, within the clinical thinking, that's crucial. And so we cannot forget that. And there is a crucial role, I think, and therefore it's, to expand on what was said earlier, I think the question is how far should the radiologist be aware of all the technical knowledge? I can do it from the clinical point of view. As a clinician, I want to understand not all the details of MRI and all these aspects, But if I don't understand anything of it, and if I just would read a report of a radiologist, this would not be good in a multidisciplinary collaboration. And it is proven and it is clear that the patient can only benefit from 1 + 1 is better than just 1. So the multidisciplinarity is crucial. So we as clinicians don't have to understand all the aspects behind AI, all the details, the technical aspects of MRI, but we have to understand at least the basis of this, of the technology also in this setting, and that's crucial. Otherwise, we will be lost. And indeed, patients will read in Leuven. Patients can read every report of everything, so they can just with an app have access to all the reports and the description of the radiologist. Right? They come to us with the reports, the radiologists, the description, not only the interpretation, but also the details of the description. If as a clinician you don't understand then anything of that, you're lost. That's so the interaction and the knowledge should be integrated in the different ways and in the different levels.
I'll offer a data scientist perspective on this. I mean, you have to think about what is the motivation for learning these skills. If as you know from the RSNA challenge, the chest X-ray one, the winner was a clinician who was programming. So it's not that you cannot do it, but in terms of training and skills required to do this, if you do it the way it is, there is tooling out there, the high schoolers are doing deep learning, right? So sure, you can learn deep learning. But and I think the question is, what is the motivation for doing it? If you are doing it to figure out how the algorithm works so you can tune it yourself, that's one thing. But if it's just for understanding, I think the onus is on the developers of the tooling to give you better tools to let them explain how they're doing their job. Otherwise, it's less, I think it's placing the work or unnecessarily on the radiologist for that sort of purpose. And having said that, there are schools now with curriculums, like there are at least 2 schools in the US that are doing a combined engineering medicine curriculum. I think at Urbana-Champaign there is one, and also at Texas, where it's interesting that they've taken 2 opposite approaches. In Urbana, they have the engineering school open up to medicine, and in Texas, they have done the other way. The medicine school is opened up to engineering. And they're trying to, so those sort of programs which do go back to the basics to teach you a full curriculum may have a better chance of breeding a new set of clinicians who are technically trained adequately for this problem. Otherwise, we might create even more chaos if each of us learns a bit of each other's fields and it's like half-baked at both sides.
Yeah, and otherwise we may go the wrong direction also, that the technical tool drives everything. The technical tool is a help, an aid to drive the clinical decisions, and the art is to integrate the different things.
I mean,
there was a talk this morning on the Watson. That's not the way we should go. We've been tested, sorry for that, I may be provocative, but the whole Watson thing and applying that to the clinical thinking, that's completely useless. We have been doing that, trying different levels of doctors. If you do that with a young medical student, he can learn something out of that. But the level doesn't go much higher to that. If you're an expert, and patients should be seen by experts, if you're an expert, then this thing in the clinical thinking is not helpful right now. So that may be provocative, but that's a reality.
No, but the way I would see is for clinicians, I would like to assume that the tool works and it does it correctly. I'd like you to go beyond that. It's like when you got cell phone, you learn how to use it and integrate it in your life. And that is not a competition to another tool in that space, or even as technology has evolved. So you absorb it and move to the next level of thinking. So in your case, doing the continuum of care, going across from personalized medicine or expanding your capabilities in those might be better ways to grow rather than go back to, get into a space of, engineering the architectures of these things to do better themselves. I think that responsibility should still be left to the engineers to do their job well, and that can be done in combination with clinicians, but keeping those spacing is my perspective.
I think we haven't heard from a chair yet, so just to give the feedback from a chair and to come back to a couple of questions ago, I would like to say that when it comes to AI, first of all, I'm not sure that I'd like to hear clinician and radiologist. We are medical doctors, and we are all on the same page. And I think that what's extremely important is for the imaging world to be less imaging-centric and more patient-centric, and use imaging in the context of that. So if I go back to what is the question to ask, or what is the first AI project I would do, the very first thing I would do is sit with Dr. Van Cutsem and say, what is the relevant, the most burning question you have right now that you need an answer to where I could help? That's the first step. And then I think that in order to answer that, we do need to create strong multidisciplinary groups that all give a view on the same subject and build a system that will then address the relevant question. And I think that being in a situation where you actually test a product that's already on the market is the very wrong way to go. You should actually have sat with the people and the programmers and the AI expert who design that product before it actually became commercial, for example. I would not like to be in a situation, been there, done that. You always find bugs, quote unquote, things are not quite relevant to your practice or what the question is. And you cannot go back. I mean, I don't know how the vendor would respond to that, but I think it's extremely hard to go back to a vendor after a product has been approved and ask them to change something. It's very costly, and it may not be feasible because they are on to the next project. So I think sitting at the table and putting having the ability to give your input in a multidisciplinary setting would be the way to go. And then do it and test it in prospective trials. I think imaging is only a push-button type of service in many prospective trials. It's only RECIST, RECIST 1.1 nowadays. I'm also the director of a tumor metrics imaging core. I have seen the numbers going up like this. The FDA still requires this, that kind of context. We need to change that and voice the knowledge that we have. In my particular practice, I actually have each one of my faculty members being adopted by a disease center, so they learn that language and can adjust to the critical clinical question and input what the imaging can provide to answer that question. But I think sitting at the table and putting imaging to the test in a prospective way would be the way to go, not just assessing a product, but also assessing the impact that imaging may have.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to switch to a question from the Twitter feed, and since you have that one teed up, I'll let you read it.
Okay, well, there's one for Dr. Illing. Are you ready? Sorry, there's quite a lot of tweets, so I'm just going through. So what is the end vision of AI in radiology market? Would the tech med companies like IBM dominate, or will market remain fragmented and health ecosystems integrate portfolio of AI algorithms into their networks one by one? What do you think is going to happen? Will there be world domination or, monopoly forming, or will we have tons and tons of small companies that are kind of nudging into the market?
Well, I think, as we know as radiologists, there are thousands of questions that can be asked. We ask ourselves thousands of questions when we look at a data set. And at the moment, most algorithms are single-use algorithms. They're just binary. Is there something there or not? So I think there's going to be a tremendous market for growth in the short term, where there'll be AI companies, spin-offs of universities, often popping up to answer specific binary questions in a very narrow way. And ultimately, as you get more holistic, because again, the question of, this is a normal scan, actually is a phenomenally complex question, if you have to account for all of the various variants of normal as well in that question. And I think, so there'll be a Cambrian explosion of AI, which will then, some will be weeded out because you'll have people going after the same question. So at the moment we're seeing a number of breast imaging algorithms coming out, and ultimately one will be better than the other probably, and so some will die off. Other questions will arise, and then there'll be a big M&A game. There'll be a big mergers and acquisitions. There'll be the IBMs and the Microsofts and the Amazons and the Googles all hoovering up the small companies that have been successful, probably, to come to some end state. But I think that's actually quite a long way away, because I think we're still on the ascent of this process, in my opinion, anyway.
Well, can I just give you an alternative reality to that, what you just said? Because I see your point, and that's the way things quite frequently go. But I also saw a good demonstration this morning that maybe the future is simply the scanners get a whole lot smarter, the PACS gets a lot smarter, the workstations do a whole lot more things for you, and it's all pretty much invisible. You didn't actually adopt an AI algorithm, you just got a smarter machine. Sort of like my microwave oven now, or my refrigerator now can order my groceries, you know.
I think I completely agree with you, and I think the question is whether the PACS company, so the Sectra, owns the AI that it runs, or it runs lots of independent AI separately. Ultimately, the question is still the same: is who owns the AI at the end of the day? And I can't help but think that the small AIs will end up selling out to the bigger vendors. And so whether it's the AIs embedded, on the machine, so they're owned by GE and Siemens, 'cause obviously they're hoovering up AI at the moment themselves, whether it works in the edge and there's that middle space, or whether it works in the PACS and the EMR data as well. So I don't know who are going to be the big consolidators. I think there's going to be a fight probably between all of those areas to try and take the most value out of it. But I agree, it'll run in the background. It won't be you choose this one or that one. It'll just